Hello, this is Wood Stuff with Hutch, and today I'm going to be making a new crosscut sled. I've been needing to do this for quite some time. As you may have seen in some of my other videos, I kind of made a mess of my old one, and I sacrificed this for some specific cuts in one project, knowing I wanted to make a new one. Now, there's a few reasons why I wanted to make a new one. One, this was really heavy. I have hard maple rear fence, hard maple front fence, MDF base, and it all added up to a lot of weight. And there were some real problems with the miter tracks. They would loosen up over time. The screws just wouldn't hold. I even tried data-wing a groove into the bottom to hold them more securely. That didn't work either. So I've got a couple ideas on this to make it a little bit lighter, as well as make sure that those miter tracks hold a little better. And the other thing I'm going to do is make it so that there are sacrificial strips in it so that I can, over time, replace where the blade goes so that it remains zero clearance and accurate. All right, let's get going. So to start with, I have a piece of 1/2 inch thick Baltic birch plywood, and I'm just going to break it down to make it easier to handle when running it through the table saw. Now I'm just going to trim up one edge, followed by flipping it around and cutting it to final width. And I do the same thing to cut it to length. For the main fence, I grabbed a piece of about, 7/4 cherry. One of the reasons I chose this is because it's going to be lighter than the hard maple. And the other reason is it's been in the shop for a long time, so I think it'll be relatively dimensionally stable. Once I've finished cutting it to rough dimensions, I go through the milling process, flattening one face and then planing it. Here I'm just doing the same process with the back fence, which I've decided to make out of a piece of red oak I had lying around. Now, obviously that's not going to help the weight issue, but it's just what I had. Following the milling, I join an edge to square. Now the fences get cut to their final length and final width. I liked the design of my old fence, so I decided just to disassemble it and use it as a template for the new fence. Here I trace the old fence onto the new fence in order to be able to rough it out on the bandsaw. And I just stapled the old auxiliary fence to the new fence in order to use it as a pattern. So I grabbed my router and put a large pattern bit in it and used that to finish the routing and finish the form on the new fence. The router bit didn't have a cut length long enough to do this cut all in one pass, so after the first one I lowered the bit and just ran it along the previous cut, and it cleaned it up just fine. I only used the router to shape the curved portions, so here I'm going to the table saw to finish the rest of the fence. Using a drum sander installed on my drill press, I just smoothed the curves into the straight portions of the fence. I decided I wanted to design the fence just like my previous version, and so that means I have an auxiliary fence that I'm going to attach to the face, and here I'm just breaking down some 1/2 inch MDF for that purpose. And since I've got everything set up for it right now, I decided to cut multiple auxiliary fences for future use. All that's required now is to trace the new fence onto the sacrificial fence and take it to the bandsaw to rough it out once again. This time I grab a 1/2 inch template bit in order to do this process. Just like the other, it follows the pattern and gives me a perfect match to my final fence. And I just ease the edges now with an 1/8 inch roundover bit. And you'll notice here that I also do the long edge that is at the bottom of the auxiliary fence. This will allow fine dust particles to settle underneath the fence and not impede how well that the workpiece actually seats against the fence. I round over the edges of the main fence as well. Moving on, I grab a piece of 1/4 inch thick MDF. This will become the sacrificial zero clearance plate in the middle of the sled. I need a piece of this MDF to set the depth of my router to make the channel for it, and here I'm just cutting a strip from the middle of the board because I found that sometimes the factory edges have a slightly different thickness than the middle. Here I draw some layout lines so that I know where the fences are, where the curve of the blade is going to be, and exactly where I need to do the router cuts for the zero clearance plate. And I just do some test cuts on a scrap piece in order to dial in the depth of cut. I really want to make sure that I match that MDF thickness as perfectly as possible. Using an edge guide that has an integrated clamp, I set it up in order to make the pass with the router bit. I flip it around and do the same thing for the second pass. A quick sanding to defuzz it, and I'm ready to move on. What I'm doing here is test fitting the zero clearance insert plate. I went to the table saw and found that I finally got it dialed in, and all I have to do is do a little sanding on the end because the router cuts weren't perfectly parallel to each other. And I simply installed it with screws. While my table saw is set at that width, I go ahead and cut several strips so that I have them for the future. Here I decided to mark the left side of where the kerf will be going on both the front and the back edges. This will allow me later to transfer a line to the bottom in order to locate the first miter track. With all this prep work out of the way, now I can attach the rear fence, putting in all of the screws, followed by attaching the main fence, the front fence, with just one screw on each end. For the runners, I decided to reuse the ones from my old sled. These are readily available for purchase, and they have expandable portions on them to help bring them into snugness with the miter gauge slot. To get them initially located, I'm using double stick tape. This is a double stick tape called spec tape that has pressure sensitive adhesive, and this product I got from Woodcraft. I'm just marking the approximate apex of the cutting curve of the blade. This will help me indicate exactly where to drop on the sled onto the runners. I take the sled now and just try to roughly place it where the blade just sticks through at the apex at the location of the rear fence. Now I just flip the sled over and use the marks that I made earlier to strike a line where the left side of the kerf will be. Now I'm taking a measurement from the left side of the kerf to the inside of the miter gauge slot. This will give me a dimension to be able to measure from the line I struck on the bottom of the sled to fine adjust the miter gauge bar. And you may be wondering why I bothered with the double stick tape in the first place, and that's so I know how far the miter gauge bar will stick out from the back of the sled. and you'll see why this is important a little later. With the location of the runner set, I now go ahead and attach it with screws, and I go ahead and flip the sled over and attach the other runner in the same way. I cut away the excess tape, and I file down the screws that are protruding through the top. Now you may be wondering, why did I not use shorter screws? Well, that's because I wanted to ensure that there's the maximum amount of screw thread that was engaged in that Baltic birch plywood, making it as secure as possible. I especially had this in mind given that my last one had the runners continuing to come loose over time. Now, these runners were not deep enough to go the entire length of the sled, so I have a third runner here that I'm going to cut up, making sure that there's a section of the expandable portion on this last little cut. And using a straight edge, I used it as my guide to make sure that I located this little section perfectly in line with the already located miter gauge bar. Also, these tracks came with threaded bolt holes and not designed to have it attached from the bottom with screws. So I grabbed my countersink bit and countersunk them from the bottom. This overall made the attachment process much easier than trying to locate bolt holes from the top face of the sled. With a test fit, I discovered that the second bar I installed caused a little bit of movement when I had it all the way extended through the full push of the cut. And so I realized I needed to pull it back further towards the front of the sled. So here I just am using a board to hold the location while I replace it closer to the front. With all this taken care of, now I'm ready to make a through cut through the sled. In order to square the fence to the blade, I'm using a 5 cuts to square method that William Ng developed. He has a YouTube video all about it, so I won't go into the details here, but I will link to it in the description below. After using this process, I did a test cut and it was dead on square. Now I can attach the auxiliary sacrificial face to the fence. The runners ended up being a little bit too snug in a couple of places, so I'm just taking a black marker, marking on the areas that expand, and I'll run it back and forth in the slots and see where a shiny spot appears, hoping that that'll tell me which areas are too snug right now. And I just loosen the screws where needed. As I mentioned earlier, the first slide that I installed had a special purpose, and that is to act as a stop so that it won't expose the blade when I'm going through a crosscut. And you can see here the slots in my outfeed table provide that stopping point. And here you can see that the blade is exposed as little as possible when doing a crosscut. In addition to giving the sled a stop, I've also decided to make sure the exposed blade is covered, so I'm just boxing it in. So there you have it. A no-nonsense, super accurate sled. You know, using that 5-cut method to square, I was able to get this fence to within 1/1000th of an inch accuracy according to how I was measuring. That's pretty fantastic. And I'm really excited about adding the safety feature. That's one less thing to worry about. And with the replaceable strips, I can always come back and replace that anytime it starts getting worn out, and it'll return it to zero clearance, which really helps with chip out on the bottom of the cut. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.